Okay, so for today's topics, we're going to look at this enzyme inhibitor. So when we use the word inhibit basically means that we want to slow down the process or you want to stop the process. So the items we use to inhibit something, this one is called as inhibitor. So inhibitor can be a lot of way of inhibit. So this one is an enzyme inhibitor. We inhibits the enzyme. So when inhibit the enzyme, basically we want to decrease or to stop the enzymatic activities. And then you start to confuse. Why we want to decrease? Higher rate better, right? So when we talk about enzyme inhibitor, we want to do it because sometimes enzyme too active. Like in our body, if some enzyme too active, we may get a disease. So therefore, this inhibitor, we can actually use it to decrease the enzymatic reaction so that you reduce the activity. So for example, certain enzyme may cause cancer. So we want to block this enzyme to reduce, okay, the effects of this enzyme. Are you clear? So therefore, the inhibitor concept actually is mostly used in the drug development. We want to stop a particular enzyme from making us sick or making us, for example, making us having certain disease. Okay, so inhibitor, now if you look at it, so we want the inhibitor can either bind to the active site or bind to the allosteric site. Okay, so allosteric site, this term we have used it before when you talk about the enzyme activators. Okay, so let us look at what is the difference and how we classify these what we call these inhibitors. Okay, okay, so let me draw. Okay, let me draw the structure. Okay, let's say when polypeptide fold into precise three-dimensional shape, it become an enzyme. Okay, so when it become enzymes, so that it create the pockets, right? Okay, the groove. Okay, for substrate to bind. So let's say this is my enzyme. Okay, okay, fold into precise three-dimensional shapes. So this is my enzyme. So the sites that allow substrate to bind. So this site is termed as the active site. Are you clear? Okay, for substrate to bind is termed as the active site. Okay, and these sites, actually, you can see that we still have a lot of pockets here. So these pockets are not for substrate, not for substrate to bind, not for substrate, not for substrate. So this kind of sites we call as a allosteric site. Are you clear? This kind of site is termed as allosteric site. Okay, so now if you look at our enzyme inhibitor can bind to the active site. Are you clear? Okay, inhibitor can bind to the active site. Inhibitor also can bind, okay, to the allosteric site. Are you clear? Okay, so now how we classify them? So now look at this. If I have inhibitor, so inhibitor, then we can classify them based on where they bind. So they can bind to the active site. They can bind to the allosteric site. So if bind to the active site, we also want to see whether they bind it tightly or bind it briefly. Okay, so when they bind it briefly, means that they bind it temporary. So this kind of the inhibitions, we term it as a competitive inhibition. Okay, competitive inhibitions. Why competitive? Now look at this. This is my enzyme. Okay, so this is my substrate. So substrate can bind, inhibitor can bind. And because the inhibitor bind it briefly, so why bind briefly? So means that inhibitor bind, the inhibitor can come out. So when inhibitor come out, substrate can rush into it. Can you see that? It's something like you compete for, like say something like a chair, right? Okay, the musical chair. So you and your friend compete for it. Clear or not? Okay, so once this okay, the inhibitor come out, substrate can immediately come and enter into the active site. So that is a form of competition between the inhibitor and substrate. So therefore, this kind of inhibitions known as the competitive inhibitions, and the item of the compound we determine as competitive inhibitor. But if let's say this inhibitor bind to the active site tightly, permanently, so means that you try to imagine if the inhibitor bind already and it bind permanently, so substrates now, oh sorry, okay, never mind, I draw it again. Okay, you try to imagine this is my enzyme. So if inhibitor bind permanently, okay, substrate now no longer can bind. No competition at all, right? Clear or not? Because if the inhibitor bind permanently, bind tightly to the active site, definitely substrate cannot bind already. One case already in this case. Are you clear? Okay, so in this case, we call it as a non-competitive inhibition. Or the inhibitor is termed as non-competitive inhibitor because there is no competition because it's bind tightly, okay? Permanently bind to my active site. So substrate no longer can bind anymore. So it means that substrate now can only see but cannot bind. Okay, so no competition. Allosteric site also the same. So it can bind either briefly or bind, okay, tightly or permanently. Okay, but again, because they bind to the allosteric site, this is my enzyme. Okay, so inhibitor will bind here. Substrate will bind here. So you can see that substrate inhibitor, they are not competing for the same sites, correct or not? No matter how, whether inhibitor bind or not, substrate, okay, I mean the active site, because inhibitor won't bind to the active site in this case. So this kind of inhibitor, we term them as a non-competitive. For both, whether tight or non, briefly, tightly or briefly, so it's the same thing. The explanation here is because of inhibition, sorry. Okay, the explanation here is because my inhibitor, they don't bind to the active site. So when they don't bind to the active site, so it means that this kind of inhibitor is called as a non-competitive inhibitor. Are you clear? So you can see that the first case, only the first case, okay, briefly have competitions. The rest is no competition at all. Why? Because when the inhibitor bind to the active site, okay, tightly, so definitely there is no competitions anymore. Are you clear? Okay, but for allosteric sites, that you can see that, okay, also non-competitive inhibitions, because why? Substrate inhibitor, they won't bind to the same site. So that's why there's no competitions. Okay. Okay, so in this activity 4.9, in this activity 4.9, you can see that, okay, enzyme inhibitor bind to the binding site, okay, active site, or bind to the allosteric site. So how we classify them? So if bind temporary or briefly, sometimes we use the word briefly, sometimes we use the word temporary. So therefore, this kind of inhibitor is termed as competitive inhibitor. If bind permanently, then we will term it as non-competitive inhibitor, because, yeah, inhibitor bind permanently, so my substrate won't be able to bind. Okay, so bind to allosteric sites, if temporary, it's known as non-competitive, and permanently also non-competitive. So why? Because inhibitor and substrate bind to different sites. So substrate won't compete with the inhibitor, or inhibitor won't compete with the substrate for the active site. Okay, So this diagram show you how the binding effect. So you can see that substrates can bind to the active site. Inhibitor also can bind to the active site. Okay, so you can see that this activator also can bind to allosteric site. Inhibitor also can bind to allosteric sites, but substrate won't bind to the allosteric site. Okay, Okay, so we started with the first part here. We talk about inhibitor that add on active sites. So if they want to bind, inhibitor want to bind to the active site, so means that their chemical structure or molecular geometry, the shape basically, okay, they must have a similar shape. Not the same shape, but similar shape to the substrate. So therefore, they will be able to bind to the active site. So when they bind to the active site, what will happen? So because they bind to the active site, they don't have any reaction take place generally. Okay, they may interact with the enzyme, but no reaction take place. But with the binding of the inhibitor to the active site, now we know that substrates cannot bind to the active site. You reduce the chance for the substrate to bind to the active site. Okay, so the inhibitor may bind to the active site temporarily or bind it permanently. So if bind to the active site temporary, so this form of the inhibitor we call it as the inhibition, we term it as a competitive inhibition. Okay, but the inhibitions that bind permanently, then we call as the non-competitive. And because of this, we do have many differences between these two forms of inhibition. Are you clear? Because of this, you have these two forms. So let us look at what are the differences. So first of all, type of inhibition definitely is a competitive inhibitions for the one that bind temporarily to the active site. But for non-competitive inhibitions, because of the inhibitor bind permanently to the active site. So what type of bonds that allow them to form? These are competitive, so temporary bond, because temporary, so they can't be the permanent bonds, right? So for permanent bonds is the covalent bond. So means that the substrate bind, sorry, not substrate, the inhibitor bind permanently to the active site by forming the covalent bonds. Okay. So these three parts a little bit confused. Okay, I will explain it later in more detail. So accept it first at this moment. So increasing substrate concentration, actually we can overcome the inhibitions, means that we can reverse the inhibitions, but the inhibitor bind permanently to the active site, sorry, no matter how you increase, that is, okay, no way, okay, no way for the substrate, okay, to overcome the inhibitions, no matter how you increase substrate concentration. Vmax, because you can overcome the inhibition, Vmax now can be achieved. The original Vmax remains the same, but if it inhibits permanently, the Vmax actually become lower. Okay, so example, for this, alcohol is used to treat the ethylene glycol poisoning. The inhibitor that bind permanently to the active sites, then we have the serine gas that act on the choline esterase or acetylcholine esterase. Okay, so for our part today, we are going to look at this. What is meant by Vmax? What is meant by increasing substrate concentration? Recall back, okay? Now we recall back what we have learned previously, okay? So what is we learned? When you plot a graph, rate of reaction or initial rate of reactions V0 versus substrate concentration. What we are going to have here is, you can see that initially increase and then level off. Correct? So if I divide my graph into two parts, when we reach the plateau, this part we know that substrate concentration no longer act as a limiting factor. So when it no longer act as a limiting factor, then we do know that now my enzyme work at the, the maximum rate. Why? Because if the substrate concentration no longer acts as a limiting factor, means substrate more than enzyme. So means that all enzyme active sites are occupied by substrate. Correct or not? Because substrate more than enzyme, so means that at particular time you can see that the enzyme active site are occupied by the substrate. So means that my enzyme all used up already, right? We use all the enzyme already, right? Because why? All already occupied. So means that my enzyme work at the maximum rate. So if I drag one line here, this will be my Vmax. Okay. So another parameter that actually we study during the enzymatic reaction is called Km, my Michaelis-Menten constant, Michaelis-Menten constant. So what will happen here is now, if I use Vmax, let's say Vmax is 100%, I half it, so therefore I get half Vmax. So if I use a half Vmax, if I draw a line to my graph and then I extrapolate to my horizontal axis, this one is termed as Km. Okay, it's termed as Km. So what is Km? Km is a constant. Okay, so what is this constant about? Km actually equal to the concentrations of substrate that allow the reactions to reach or to achieve half of the maximum rate of reactions. Are you clear? So means if I use this concentration of substrate, then I will be able to achieve half of the Vmax. Are you clear? So means that I will have the half of the maximum rate of reactions. So what's Km actually indicates? Km actually indicates the affinity. Affinity of enzyme for its substrate or inhibitor. So this is affinity. So what's mean affinity? The light, the love in this case, affinity is high, means that love more. So if enzyme affinity for the substrate is high, okay, when the enzyme love the substrate, they will bind to the substrate. Are you clear? So means that if affinity is high, enzyme more likely to bind to the substrate. So write down. So what is affinity? When affinity is high, so enzyme are more likely to bind to the substrates when affinity is high. Okay, so how the Km value actually indicate the affinity? When the Km value is high, affinity is low. I will explain this later. So on the other hand, when the Km value is low, affinity is high. Okay, remember this first. I will explain it more later. Okay, you have to look at overall concept. So at this moment, I know a lot of questions, but it's okay. Okay, you can ask me later. Okay, now understand this. So come back to this. So this reaction actually without, okay, without what? Without inhibitor. Normal. Okay, without inhibitor. But now let us look at if we have the competitive inhibitor, what will happen to the graph? Okay, here, now look at this. So with competitive inhibitor, okay, with competitive inhibitor. So what will happen here is, again, the same graph. Now look at this. This is initial rate of reactions versus the substrate concentration, this graph. So I draw back the same graph. This is without inhibitor. So normal. Are you clear? So we have this Vmax. Okay, I use the red color. Red color means the original Vmax. So if I halve the Vmax, you will get the Km. Are you clear? So this is original Km, so Vmax. Okay. Now what will happen here if my reactions I add the inhibitor? So always remember, when I add inhibitor, it must be low concentration of inhibitor. If you add high concentration inhibitor, then we won't be able to study because all enzymes are inhibited. What you want to study? As if, for example, you want to look at the effect, okay, of the drug onto my mouse. Okay, let's say, for example, then you feed them in the high toxic drug, everything die already, then you claim they all die, full stop. You won't see the effect all die. What do you mean here? I also know what, if I give a toxic in high concentration, all will die. But what is the concentration will make them die? You don't know, right? So in this case, you must put in a low concentrations of the inhibitors, okay? So now, if you put a low concentration inhibitor, then you will see that, okay, the second graph now come, right? You will get the second graph. Can you see that? Okay. So what actually happened here? With competitive inhibitor, you will realize that, first point, Vmax now still remain the same. Are you clear? We can overcome these inhibitions by achieving back the Vmax. Are you clear? So why Vmax can be achieved back? So because inhibitor, you have to understand that inhibitor bind briefly, temporary. Are you clear? So when the inhibitor bind briefly, they will bind, they will release. When release, my substrate have chance to bind. Are you clear? To overcome these inhibitions. So what we can do here is something like we go for the gang fight. If I have few of us only fight with, I mean, like few of us, we are substrate. Okay, try to imagine, sir. This is I said. So we have substrate. Okay, 3 of us want to fight with the inhibitor. Cannot. 1-to-1, we lost. No problem. We use number. We add more. Come on, okay? We don't fight 1-to-1. We fight many to 1. So means that one chance I will be able to KO my inhibitor. Right? Are you clear? So in this concept here is we win by using number. Okay? Alone we can't win. We teamwork, we team up, we gang out. Okay? We have 10, we have 20, we have 100 of us to fight with the inhibitor. Inhibitor, we cannot change, right? We don't put it high concentration. So we fight with the number. So it means that inhibitor, because inhibitor bind briefly, so at one particular time, you can see that if I increase the substrate concentration until a moment high enough, okay, at that particular times now all active site are occupied by substrate. So it means that no inhibitor have chance to bind. So it means that if all active sites are occupied by the substrate, it go back to original. It go back to original state where we can achieve back the Vmax. But the question here is, okay, can I use back the same amount or same concentration on substrate? No, because I have to increase the substrate concentration. So therefore, you can see that I have a new Km. So this Km is with inhibitor. Okay, I use IC. The IC stand for, I mean, don't use IC in the exam, but basically I just use short form. It means competitive inhibitor. Are you clear? Okay. So in this case, now you can see that Km second, Km now higher. So what's mean Km higher? Km higher indicate what? Why Km higher? Km higher because we need higher concentration of substrate to achieve half Vmax. So means that affinity of enzyme for its substrate now lower. Are you clear? Why Km increase? Because we need more substrate. We need more substrate to actually achieve half Vmax. So therefore, affinity of the enzyme now is, therefore its substrate become lower. Are you clear? Okay. So it's still recording a while. Okay, so now look at it. If with non-competitive inhibitor. So again, I draw the graph. Okay, so this is a initial rate of reactions, and then we have a substrate concentration. Okay, so now what we're going to do here is, okay, we have the graph without the inhibitor. So these are without inhibitor. So without inhibitor, again, I use the red color, draw a line, because we do know that when level off means substrate concentration no longer, okay, substrate concentration no longer act as the limiting factor. So therefore, my enzyme work at the maximum rate. So Vmax here. So half of the Vmax. Okay, I will get my Km. Okay, so this is with no inhibitor. Okay, so now next. Okay, now what I'm going to do here is if I add a small amount or low concentrations of the non-competitive inhibitor, what you're going to get here is a different graph now. Okay, so you can see that. Okay, make sure that I draw it correctly. So you can see that this one is with non-competitive inhibitor. So with non-competitive inhibitor, now you can see that I use a green color. I have a new Vmax now. Can you see that? I have new Vmax. So if I halve the Vmax now, new half Vmax, you realize that I get back the same Km. Can you see that? I gain back the same Km. Okay, so for non-competitive inhibitor, what I'm writing here, inhibitor. Okay, so with non-competitive inhibitor, you can see that first, what is the effect? Vmax become lower, but Km remain the same. Are you clear? So now, why Vmax become lower? Why Km remain the same? This is the part that we need to understand now. Okay, so before we proceed to understand the Vmax and Km, let me show you one analogy. Okay, so this is normally how I always teach my students to think differently. Then you will get the idea. Okay, now try to imagine, sir. Try to imagine. Okay, this is my company. Okay, this is my company. So this company, I have 10 staff. Okay, so each staff can complete one work per one day. So what is my rate? What is my rate? My rate will be 10 units of work done per day. Okay, so 10 staff, so 10 of them work whole day, they reach what we call the Vmax maximum already. Because if I give them 20 works, 30 works, 40 works, also useless, because maximum they can do is 10 works per day. Are you clear? So it means that this is the Vmax maximum rate that I can achieve already. But now what will happen to my company? Okay, so very sad, in this case, 2 of them die, COVID, let's say, 2 of them die. So I have 8 staff only. Are you clear? 2 of them die, okay, because of the disease, for example. Okay, so what happened to my rate? What is my new rate? Now, why is it that they die? Okay, I'll answer you. Okay, 2 of them die already. So it means that the workable staff here, okay, workable staff now, my new rate will be 8 units. So it means that you can see that there is decrease of the Vmax compared to the original one. Correct? Okay, so this is similar to my enzyme. If first I have 10 enzyme, okay, At first, I have 10 enzymes. Okay, and I have small number of the inhibitor. So I have 2 inhibitor. And this is a non-competitive inhibitor. So what's non-competitive inhibitor? So means that you're going to bind permanently. So means that these 2 inhibitor going to bind permanently to my 2 enzyme active site. So means that out of 10 enzymes, can I have 10 enzymes working now? No, because of these 2 inhibitor. So means my 10 enzyme now reduced to 8 workable enzyme. Even though my enzyme actually is 10, but only 8 of them working. 2 of them didn't work. Why? Because they already paralyzed. In this case, they can't do anything because inhibitor bind permanently. So means that they are gone already. They can't do anything. So only 8 enzyme can function. Can I see that? So definitely Vmax lower. So why Vmax lower? Why Vmax lower? Because there is a decrease in the number or concentration of functional enzyme. Are you clear? So the number of the workable enzyme, functional enzyme, or functioning enzyme actually lower already. So that's why Vmax definitely lower. Are you clear? But why Km remain the same? Why Km remain the same? Now look at this. These 2 inhibitor already bind. These 2 already bind to the active site already, permanently, okay, tightly. So basically means that now these 8 enzymes, do they need to face inhibitor? No more inhibitor already. Why? All of them bind already. This small number of the inhibitor already bind to the, okay, this small number inhibitor already bind to the enzyme active site tightly. So they won't release anymore. So means that now these 2 enzymes sacrifice themselves, okay, to bind the inhibitor. So the rest of them, they are safe. So means that do they need to face the inhibitor? They do not need to face inhibitor anymore. So therefore, the affinity now no change. They still continue to work. They still continue to accept the work. Can you see that? Because they don't need to worry about inhibitor anymore, right? Initially they worry, right? Because inhibitor, but 2 of them sacrifice. Never mind, I bind. Okay, let me die. Never mind. The 2% die already. So, but no more inhibitor. So therefore, what is affinity? So affinity remain the same. So why affinity remain the same? Because in this case, all inhibitor already bind to the enzyme. So it means that the remaining enzyme actually can work normally. Can you see that? So it means that the affinity for the substrate, they don't need to choose inhibitor. Right? When I do my work, will I be disturbed by the inhibitor? They don't need to worry anymore. So the affinity, they concentrate on their substrate enough already. So that's why Km remain the same. Okay, so you can take a photo if you need. Okay, so I try my best to simplify it. Hopefully that you will be able to understand the concept here. So we have 2 examples here. One is the ethylene glycol poisoning. Another one is the serine. Ethylene glycol poisoning is the one example how this inhibitor actually bind. Ethylene glycol is an inhibitor bind to the enzyme briefly, and luckily they bind briefly. How we can actually increase the substrate concentration to overcome the inhibition. Okay, serine gas, no choice. Serine gas actually bind permanently to my active site, so it forms covalent bonds. Okay, so let us look at it. Ethylene glycol is a poison. Okay, caused by drinking accidentally. Normally we won't drink this ethylene glycol, but sometimes we do not know, we drink it wrongly, so we drink it. Okay, what happened here is this ethylene glycol will be metabolized by the enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase. So this alcohol, what will they do? They will convert to this ethylene glycol to the glycoaldehyde and then oxidize to this glycolic acid. So it means that your blood now increase in the acid, okay, accumulation of acid, then it will cause the metabolic acidosis. And we do know that too too, the acidity definitely we're going to cause a problem to us. So what we need to do, we want to get rid of this ethylene glycol, but the problem here is we need to act fast. How we can do? We can actually ask the ethanol to compete with the ethylene glycol for the enzyme. So this is an inhibitor, and they bind briefly. So we know about this. So we give high concentration of the ethanol. So when ethanol concentration is high, ethanol can compete with this ethylene glycol to bind to the alcohol dehydrogenase. Therefore, ethylene glycol no chance to bind the alcohol dehydrogenase, give time to our body to actually excrete the ethylene glycol out. So this is one. If let's say ethylene glycol bind permanently to my enzyme, so sorry, nothing much we can do already because they bind permanently. But no, in this case, they bind briefly so that I can increase my substrate concentration. The alcohol will increase into the higher concentration. Therefore, I will be able to overcome the inhibition. Are you clear? Okay. Now, how about serine? Serine is a chemical, we call this a neurotoxin that we can use it to as a what we call a chemical weapon. Okay, terrorists sometimes use it. So what happened here is this serine is an inhibitor by inhibiting this acetylcholinesterase. Okay, so just now my answer here say cholinesterase, actually can add in acetylcholinesterase. Actually, it's the same thing. So what happened here is they inhibit this enzyme by forming covalent bond with the particular serine residues. Therefore, our gland and muscle will continue to stimulate. We will become very, very tired and no longer can breathe. We will die painfully. Okay, so this part, too bad because we have to learn in A2 only, you understand. Okay, so what happened here is I use a very simple way to explain. Now, you are muscle. Okay, you are muscle. That's me. Okay, me is a neurotransmitter. Okay, then I have my boss here. My boss is the enzyme. So what will happen normally is my boss, okay, will control me, right? It will give me a salary and everything. So what happened here is, so my instructions to you is jump. So if I tell you jump, you jump. I tell you jump, you jump. Are you clear? So neurotransmitter idea is cause the muscle to contract. Neurotransmitter will give the instruction to the muscle, contract. Boss is the one that say, okay, now, okay, your job is done. So basically it's this, okay, I ask you to jump, you jump one time, and then my boss say, okay, enough, no need to do anything. But now the problem is this enzyme, now my boss is inhibited by serine. So my boss actually is quite quiet already, silence already, can't do anything. Are you clear? Because inhibited. So what will happen here is, I don't know. I don't know because boss didn't give me instructions, say no need to jump. So I will continue to tell you jump, jump, jump. And you have to follow jump, jump, jump. Okay, so example that my boss didn't say that, okay, you cannot give the test to the student anymore. So I continue to give a test. Today test, tomorrow test, the next day also test, every day test. You will be tired. Okay, until you say, oh, I don't want to take A-level anymore. Cannot see that. So this is the idea of our muscle. So in this case, I do have the enzyme to degrade the neurotransmitter so that muscle can relax. But now with the serine gas actually inhibits the enzyme so permanently. So therefore, we don't have enzyme to degrade the neurotransmitter. Muscle will continue to contract until you tired, and then you won't be able to breathe, and then you will die. I mean, the person will die. An exposed person will die painfully. Okay. So with this, I have done for today's class.